Yo, welcome back to the channel, boys and girls. In today's video, we are taking a look at this 2024 Canon Aeroad. As you can tell, I'm very excited to have this bike in hand, and shout out to one of my buddies here locally in Chicago who was so kind and generous enough to let me borrow his bike for the next few weeks. I gotta say, the cycling community here in Chicago has been fantastic. You guys have been so generous helping me out on this channel for the last 4 years. So in today's video, guys, we're going to be going over the specs and details on this 2024 Canon Aeroad. Of course, we're going to take it out on the road so I can give you some of my first initial thoughts on this bike. And then the overall plans for this bike is, this first video, of course, is going to be a first look and the first impressions. Second video will be a longer term review on this bike after I've ridden it for a few weeks. And then if you guys behave on this channel, I might just do a third video comparing this Canon Aeroad to my Tarmac SL8 as well as my Giant Propel. So without further ado, let's begin. So as I mentioned in the introduction of this video, guys, this is the 2024 Canon Aeroad. This is the CF SLX version of this frame set. This basically is the tier just below the flagship version of this Canon Aeroad. Now, looking at the aesthetics and the design of this frame, you're probably wondering why this looks like the previous generation, even though it's a 2024. And the reason for that is because the latest version of that Aero was released during the middle of this year. And so my buddy who purchased this frame, he actually ended up buying this generation. And then the new generation of the Aero came out like a month later. So nonetheless, this is the previous generation from like 2023, 2022. But the good news is my buddy tells me that one of the main issues with this previous generation of Aero pertaining to the seat post has been fixed. So there's no need to be faffing around to try to prevent the seat post from creaking. All of that has been fixed with this 2024 version of the Aeroad. Now, what made me really interested in trying out this frame, obviously one, because it is a Canon Aeroad, but another reason too is the owner of this bike, he's like 6'1" in height, and so this is actually a size large. Now, if you've been following this channel for some time, you know that I typically run like a size medium or like size 56 frame set. So this essentially is a size 58. And if you notice also too with my builds, I tend to run smaller frames with longer stems on it. And I've always been curious on how I would feel and what would be the riding dynamics by going up in a larger size frame and having a shorter stem at the front. So this is a size 58. The retail on this is about $6,000 or $6,200 USD. And as you can see, this comes with a full SRAM Force ETAP group set as well as the power meter as well. It comes with the Zip 404 Firecrest wheels. It comes with the Sella Italia saddle, and then of course the integrated cockpit. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about this handlebar setup here. So as you can see, this is a carbon integrated cockpit. Now, what Canon has decided to do is to run a style of cockpit that allows you to adjust the width on this cockpit rather than having to buy a completely different size if you want to go with a different width. So essentially on both sides of the cockpit there are 4 screws total that allows you to adjust the width on this. So right now the owner, he has it set up to have a 39 centimeter width. I believe you can go anywhere from like 40 down to 37 centimeters as far as width goes. So I typically run like a 38 centimeter width, but I'm basically going to keep it as is. Now the length of the stem is 90 millimeters. Again, because this owner is 6'1" in height, it's pretty long reach as far as the frame goes. I want to say it's like 403 millimeters as far as the frame reach, and so he has a 90 millimeter stem. So it's going to be interesting to see how this handles out on the road as far as the riding dynamic goes. One thing I do want to note, and this is a strong criticism that I have with Canon, especially speaking to other Canon owners here in Chicagoland, is it comes with just a standard 110 millimeter length stem for the integrated cockpit. So if you want to run a different length cockpit, you have to pay $420 USD to get this swapped out. Canon only provides one length cockpit from the factory, so you have to buy an additional handlebars. You have to try to sell the existing one, and then you're going to have to take it to a professional mechanic to have those handlebars swapped out. So Even though in theory this overall bike, I want to say it's like $6,000, $6,200 USD. Sure, there are some tangible savings there, but just remember that you're going to be on the hook to spend probably another $500 if you do need a separate or different integrated cockpit. Now moving on to the saddle, this saddle is standard when you purchase a complete bike from Canon. This is a Sella Italia. I believe this is their Super Flow saddle. The rails on this comes with steel rails, but it's interesting because even though these have steel or maybe like titanium type of rails, the weight on the saddle is pretty light. It's only 180 grams. So this actually is just as light as some of my carbon rail saddles. One thing that's interesting about the dimensions on the saddle is the length on it is pretty standard. It's a short North saddle. It's like 248 millimeters as far as the length. But then the width on this, again, this is standard from Canon. The width on this is only 130 millimeters wide. Now, I typically run my saddles at a width of like 143 millimeters. So it's going to be interesting to see if this narrow saddle is going to feel any better or worse. Now, again, the owner of this bike is 6'1", and he's a strong rider here in Chicago. So he seems to get along with it just fine. He's not any wider or narrow than I am, but nonetheless, this is a saddle that you get. So again, if you need a wider saddle, you're going to have to cough up more money in order to swap that out. But that's pretty typical when you buy a complete bike. Not all saddles that come from the factory are going to work for every single rider out there, but just know that you will have to budget some money if this saddle does not work for you. Okay, let's go ahead and get this over with. So the wheels that come stock on this Canyon Aeroad from Canyon is the Zip 404 Firecrest wheels. If you were to buy these wheels separately on a reputable website, you would probably spend around $1,800 to $2,000 for these wheels. So again, considering this frame as a whole costs you about $6,000, it's a pretty good value, all things considered. Now I have done a separate video on the Zip 404 Firecrest wheels. It probably has been almost exactly a year ago from the time of this video, but nonetheless, some of the specs on these wheels is the depth on it is 58 millimeters, both front and rear. The internal width on these is 23 millimeters. The external width is like 27.66. And then the weight on these, they're not the lightest wheels in the world, but they come in at a weight of like 1,567 grams. The bearings inside are of course steel, and then the spokes as well are steel as well. So you are getting a very popular set of wheels that comes with this Canyon. A lot of people here locally in Chicago, they really like these wheels, and even though these aren't going to be the top of the line wheels, the good news is because of what you're spending on this bike as an entire package, you may be able to just save up and buy a second set of wheels if you want something either a little bit more lighter or something with just a little bit more performance out of it. Now, the tires that are included with these Zip wheels are Continental GP5000 STR tubeless tires in the 28C variants. Now, the reason why they come with tubeless tires is because, as you guys know, and you guys know how I feel about this already, these Zip wheels are unfortunately hookless. But the owner of this bike, just as I have done myself when I've ran hookless tires or hookless wheels, is he is running TPU tubes in these tubeless tires. So that's one of the downsides with hookless wheels is you essentially have to run tires that have been approved to run tubeless. So he's adopted to do that as well as to use TPU inner tubes. Now, I'm not sure exactly how much this owner of this bike, how much he weighs. He weighs a little bit more than me, of course, because he is taller. But the max tire pressure on these is like 73 PSI, which is not that much, especially if you're running 28C tires. So if you weigh, say you weigh like 85 kilograms, you're going to probably have to bump up these tires to maybe like a 30 or 32C with tires. But nonetheless, this is what he's running. He says he runs it no more than 80 PSI, but just keep that in mind that you're going to have to check your weight and use an online tire pressure calculator to determine what's going to be the optimal tire size for running hookless wheels. And moving on to the final part of this bike, which is the group set. So as you guys can see, this is the latest version of SRAM Force ETAP group set. This owner, despite the fact that he is 6'1", he's running 170 millimeter length cranks. And he said, just as I have said, that moving to shorter cranks has been a game changer. In fact, for myself, I have adopted all my main staple of bikes over to 170 millimeter length cranks. In fact, I really need to do a separate video just talking about how much of a game changer it has been to move to shorter cranks. And then as far as the chainring out front, he has a 48-35 crank, which comes standard from Canon. The cassette in the back, I believe this either is a 10-30 or 10-28. Of course, both front and rear derailleurs on there. And like I said, it does include a power meter. So you figure if you were to purchase this group set on its own, all in, you're probably looking at about $2,000 or more. So you figure $2,000 for the wheels, $2,000 for the group set, and then for the frame and all the other components. You're now starting to see why Canon is so popular, because they do offer up a lot of value. Now granted, $6,200 USD is not cheap by any stretch of the imagination, but you do get a lot of quality components given the price. Free hub sound test on the Zip 404 Firecrest wheels with the steel bearings and steel spokes. Canyon Aeroad 2024. So let's continue. Absolutely gorgeous fall day here on the north side of Chicago on the lakefront. As you guys can see, that's right, I shaved off my beard. I'm looking like a freaking motorcycle police officer. Actually, on my ride over here on the lakefront, there was like a 70-year-old white lady. She looked over at me, she saw my outfit, she saw my bike, and this lady straight up smiled at me and nodded. Can you imagine that? As I always say, tell your grandma and your auntie to holler at me. I'm gonna take her on a date to Applebee's. But anyway, let's go ahead and get all the negative stuffs on this bike out of the way right away. Now, these negative points are subjective, and they are very specific to my bike fit, my riding style, my body composition, etc. So the first things first is this cockpit with this 90 millimeter stem is way too short for my style of riding. It's twitchy. And as you guys probably know by now, when you do run a shorter length stem, it does make the ride a little bit more twitchy. So when you're in the drops, this isn't really a big deal. You don't really notice it. But as soon as you get out of the saddle, for just how I climb and how I ride out of the saddle, it's a little bit too twitchy for my comfort. So I would definitely need to run a longer stem. The second thing I want to talk about is just the overall size for the size 58. So immediately when I hopped on this bike today, I knew right away that a size 58 or a size large or extra large, whatever this translates to, I already know right away that this frame is too large for me, particularly with the stand over height and the height of the bottom bracket. Now, I'll have to look at the geometry chart to determine whether or not the bottom bracket height increases as the size of the frame increases. But just standing over this bike at a red light, I can feel that my legs are rubbing on the top tube. This is something I don't really experience with my other bikes that are like a size 56. So yeah, the frame, unfortunately for me, is just a bit too tall. Moving on to some of the positive aspects on this frame. So like I mentioned as one of the negative points, even though the standover height for this particular size is too tall for me, essentially I feel like I'm riding on top of the bike versus inside of the bike, kind of like a cockpit, due to that size. Now, despite it being too tall, the overall reach on this frame is spot on. It's bang on at like a 403 millimeters or something like that. The overall reach is fantastic. The stack height is also really good as well. Now, if I were to own this bike permanently, I would of course swap out the cockpit for something longer, and I would be able to lower this cockpit enough to get a really good feel and sort of on the bike position as well. And I do believe, I have to double check on the website, but I do believe that you can actually remove these spacers and lower this one-piece cockpit without having to cut the steer tube, because as you guys can see, there is no way to run spacers on top of the cockpit. So Canyon thought about this, obviously, so you are able to lower the cockpit by taking out these spacers without having to cut the steer tube. So the overall reach on this is really, really good considering the size. And because of the length and the overall stack height for this size, You've noticed now in cycling that there has been a trend to move to more of a TT position on the hoods, where your arms are essentially at a 90-degree angle. And if I were to actually slam this stem, I would still be able to do that comfortably while still having enough reach to be able to run that without having my knees hit my elbows at that 90-degree position. Some other aspects of this bike that I really like is I absolutely love this paint job. Like, look how sparkly and shimmery this silver paint job is. When you're in the shade, it's very subdued and it looks almost like just a stale matted color gray, but as soon as the sunlight hits it, it looks fantastic. I really appreciate the paint job that Canyon did. Of course, the paint quality is something that you would expect at this price point. And I really love the overall aesthetics of this aero frame. There really aren't too many aero frames on the market today that really have a absolute aero chunky tubes profile. And quite frankly, among those, there really aren't too many that really get me excited. It's basically this, and then of course the latest Factor Austro VAM. So kudos to Canyon for making just marginal updates to work out some of the quirks from their previous generation of Aeroads to make a bike that is aesthetically pleasing and a lot of people will appreciate. You see this thing flying by you and you know that it definitely means business. And the last thing I want to talk about is this Sella Italia saddle. Now, I had mentioned in the specs breakdown of this video that the width on this saddle is 130 millimeters. Now, I typically run a 143 millimeter width saddle, and I was really concerned that this saddle would actually be too narrow. It turns out that that was absolutely incorrect. This saddle is very comfortable. I'm gonna save the overall ride dynamics of this bike for a separate segment in this video, but just immediately as I got on this saddle is so comfortable. And at $125 that you can probably get on Amazon, I might actually buy this saddle and try it on one of my other bikes, because I was absolutely blown away on how comfortable this saddle was, just how it makes me feel on it. I thought that my sit bones would probably slide to one side or just not be fully supported, because it is so narrow than what I'm used to, but it is very, very comfortable. And I suspect that going down to a 130 millimeter width saddle might be what I actually need, despite what the online bike fitters might say. It's hard to imagine 4 years ago, when I first started my cycling YouTube channel, that I would ever get to a point where I would be fortunate enough to test and review these higher end bikes like my Giant Propel, my Tarmac SL8, and now this Canyon Aeroad. And I would not be able to do any of this if it wasn't for your support, all you viewers out there all across the globe, and also to my local cycling community here in Chicago. All you guys have been so supportive. You've helped me out with my bike builds, helping me source parts, even little things like custom decals on my frame. All these little things I appreciate so much, and I hope that I can continue to test and review these bikes for as long as I possibly can. This bike is fast. It's a lot faster than I thought it was going to be, and it is also significantly more comfortable than I thought it was going to be. You look at the way this frame is designed and you expect it to be harsh and stiff. Not at all. Now granted, these zip wheels do play a part of that, running TPU tubes, etc. But this bike, it feels fast, and it most certainly is very comfortable. It's more comfortable than my Giant Propel, almost as comfortable as my Tarmac SL8. Man, it's just amazing how great these modern bikes are, this current generation of frames. This frame is really, really good. So the one thing I will say is, because of the weight of this bike's like 18 pounds, it doesn't feel as snappy off the line as my Tarmac SL8, and it doesn't really have that perceived stiffness. Even though this bike is stiff, it just doesn't have that sensation of stiffness as my Giant Propel. But once you get up to whatever prescribed speed you're trying to get to, whether you're in a tailwind, whatever, that is where the aerodynamics of this bike, as far as I can tell, that's where this bike comes alive. This bike wants to sit at the faster speeds, and then you begin to realize how easy it is to push the pedals to maintain your watts, because of just how fast this bike feels out on the road. It's really just a shame that for my height and for my riding style, the height or the standover height of this frame is just too tall for me. But other than that, if I were to get a longer stem cockpit, the setup on this bike would be perfect for me. In fact, I low-key want to buy a Canyon Aeroad for my next long-term bike to review, because this bike, I'm shocked of how comfortable it is and just how ease of speed it is on this. Of course, all of this is sort of those first initial excitement when you're hopping on a brand new bike, so it's hard to be completely objective. But other than the standover height, perhaps if I were to go down to a large or a smaller frame size and get a longer stem, work on the front end with the stack height to be optimal, I think this bike would be really, really good for a long-term bike. Let's touch again on the area of stiffness. Now, it's not that this bike is not as stiff as my Giant Propel. That is not true at all. You got to figure there are World Tour level racers using this bike, as well as American crit racers, professionals also using this Canyon Aeroad. So the bike is plenty stiff, but somehow the Germans have engineered the frame in such a way that you get the responsiveness that you would expect for an aero frame like this, but it doesn't have the chatter, doesn't have the rattle, and just the harshness that you would expect by looking at this frame. It's quite comfortable. So in a perfect world, what I would do is I would keep the same size of this size 58 or size large, but I would just ever so slightly lower the standover height, get a longer cockpit, keep the same saddle, slap on some lighter wheels. You know, I've reviewed a lot of wheels. Make sure my TT position over the hoods is immaculate, and your boy Patty would be flying. No lie, guys, I am considering buying a frame set. It's just sad that Canyon does not sell this as a frame set alone option, because this definitely would be on my short list of aero frames to test out for 2025. Now, the main reason I have yet to do a comparison video between my Tarmac SL8 and my Giant Propel is simply because I just can't decide which of those two bikes I prefer more than the other. I like them both for different reasons. They're both plenty fast, but just the road dynamics and the characteristics of them, they both are just slightly different. But what I can say with this Canyon Aeroad is, so far off of this first few miles, or at this point, I don't know, mile 30, this bike might actually be a love child of those two frames. That's basically what this Aeroad kind of feels like based on sort of first initial impressions. It just has some of the road dynamics that I've come to expect from my Giant Propel, but it just handles bumps in such a way that resembles my Tarmac SL8. So yeah, guys, I'll probably do a comparison video on all three of these frames, but this is what this frame feels like in comparison to those two. Now, when you run a larger frame size based on your height, you do have significant less risk of having toe overlap with the front wheel. However, due to the taller standover height of the frame, that also means that you have less of your seat post exposed. So while, yes, this frame is comfortable, more comfortable than I had expected, I do imagine that you could have a little bit of extra comfort if you went back down to a smaller frame size, because you would have more seat posts exposed, which means more seat posts would be able to flex and sort of smooth out some of those very rough edges out on the road. So overall, I'm very impressed with this frame so far. It makes sense why this bike is pretty popular here in Chicagoland. I want to say I've seen about 5 or 6 Aeroads roaming around. I've seen them on my fast group rides as well. So they are a popular choice here for a bike that's completely fully built up. You don't have to worry about components. You make your purchase online, you wait for the bike to ship, and you're basically ready to go, assuming all the components and the sizes and dimensions works for you. So that is going to wrap up today's video, guys. As I said earlier, be on the lookout, as I will have a follow-up and more thorough review on this Canyon Aeroad. But as always, questions, comments, and concerns, please feel free to leave them down below, and I will check you guys on the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to my homie for letting me borrow this bike for a few weeks. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.